All right, in lecture 4, we're going to be talking about some problems with our inflation measure of CPI. So we've talked about problems in all of our macroeconomic indicators, the problems with the unemployment rate, the problems with GDP. There are also problems with our inflation rate. So much of what you'll hear whenever you hear people refer to macroeconomics, it can be controversial. So we can have arguments over things like what is the real unemployment rate, something that doesn't tend to happen as much with microeconomics. So it's important as we go through all of these indicators to really understand, okay, what are the potential problems that we can experience when we're looking at these numbers? So first, what do we have for problems and how does this impact our measure of inflation? So we're going to go through and discuss 3 different problems with our measure CPI, and then how does that affect our inflation measure. And this is going to be very important because remember, we talk about those COLA adjustments, the cost of living adjustments. And so if we have a problem with our inflation rate and this measure of CPI, then that's going to lead to the COLA adjustments not being accurate or not really either overstating or understating the actual effect of inflation, and so actually changing the purchasing power rather than just adjusting to maintain a standard of living. All right, so first problem with our measure of CPI. So as I mentioned in the syllabus, I live in Iowa and I do travel to South Carolina so I can meet with students at least once throughout the semester. And so I typically fly between Iowa and South Carolina. But what happens if the price of an airline ticket starts to drastically increase? Well, now all of a sudden the substitutes for flying become more attractive. And so I'm going to actually change my behavior as the price of airline tickets increases. I might decide to drive instead. And so what becomes important are the relative prices of goods and services in our economy. And so it's as the price of the airlines increases, I change my behavior, I consume less airlines, but CPI uses a fixed basket. And since CPI uses a fixed basket, we have this substitution bias. So over time, some prices rise faster than others. And so in my example, I talked about the airline tickets increasing faster than, say, the price of gasoline. And so consumers are going to substitute our behavior, our consumption, towards the price of goods that have become relatively cheaper. And so CPI misses the substitution because their basket is fixed. So anytime the relative prices have changed, so let's say something like the bird flu hit, there is a huge decrease in the supply of chicken, and so the price of chicken increases drastically. Well, now the typical consumer is going to purchase less chicken. We're going to substitute that for something like beef, pork, fish, whatever it is, and CPI is going to miss this substitution because we use a fixed basket. We want to try and keep that basket the same over time so that we can really see how has the prices of goods changed. So CPI misses this, and this is going to cause CPI to overstate the actual increase in the cost of living because my basket is still going to say that I flew to South Carolina. It's going to keep that basket exactly the same, even though that's not actually what I did. I drove because it was cheaper. And so the substitution bias overstates the increase in the cost of living. So it's going to make the inflation rate look higher than it actually is. All right, so let's kind of think about our baskets over time. So if we're trying to compare, remember we have this fixed basket. We can think about a basket in the 1920s and the goods and services that a household in the 1920s purchases. Okay, and then let's think about the 1980s. And again, we can think about the goods and services that a consumer in the or a household in the 1980s is consuming, things like VCRs and video recorders, records. And then what about a basket in 2016? Our basket today looks very different from those baskets over time. But when we're thinking about CPI, our consumer price index, we have that fixed basket. And since we have a fixed basket, the introduction of new goods poses another problem. So something like Netflix didn't exist in the 1980s. And if we want to try and keep our basket fixed, this can definitely create some problems. So the introduction of new goods can can help our dollars become more valuable, is what I want to say. Our dollars become more valuable because it increases variety. It allows consumers to find products that more closely meet their needs. And so something like our current iPhones, they not only have the capability, or they do what our our landlines used to do, but they also better meet our needs as consumers, because now my phone also takes the place of a video recorder, of a camera, of a computer, of all of those different things. It also takes the place of a lot of games that I used to play, board games. And so now this introduction of a cell phone and this current cell phone that I have, it allows to better meet my needs. And so my dollars all of a sudden became more valuable. The $100 that I'm spending, the $500 I'm spending on my phone is more valuable to me. And so the introduction of that new good. Another introduction of a new good that our BLS is not equipped with is they don't recognize online retailers. And so a lot of Americans are shopping online these days, whether it's for clothing or using Amazon to purchase their daily products that they need, things like paper towels and cleaning products and even food. Purchasing them online, BLS only looks at retail outlets when they're collecting costs. And often what we find are retail outlets do have higher prices than their online counterparts. And so what we're going to see is that, again, BLS, the CPI measure, misses this effect, and it's going to overstate the actual cost of living increase. So it's going to say that the inflation rate is higher because, yes, my phone now costs me $500, whereas in the 1980s, a phone definitely did not cost $500. However, this $500 phone, it allows me to it meets my needs in a better way than a phone did 20 years ago. Also, those retail outlets, only being the ones we're measuring, typically have higher prices than their online counterparts, again, overstating the actual increase in the cost of living. So the introduction of new goods having a pretty large role in CPI over the last 10 to 20 years, and actually overstating the increase in inflation. All right, let's think about the price of a Mac computer in 1984 was $2,495. The price in 2017 of an Apple iMac is $1,999. And so the price went down, and wow, look at the drastic difference between the computers. So what we're talking about here is just the change in quality. So we have an unmeasured quality change. If the price of the computer over the past 30 years has been almost constant, pretty similar in price. However, the quality of that product has changed drastically. And so quality is a very difficult piece to measure. The BLS does try to account for some quality changes, the fact that our computers today have much more capabilities than the ones in the 1980s, but they do probably miss some because it is hard to measure quality. And so again, CPI is going to overstate the actual increase in the cost of living. So things are going to look more expensive, but they actually have better quality. And so CPI overstates the actual cost of living, overstating the inflation rate. So we have these three problems with our measure of CPI. We can talk about the substitution bias, the introduction of new good, and unmeasured quality changes, all overstating the increase in the cost of living. And again, this does have actual effects. So why is this important? It's important because we have the Social Security payments and other wage contracts that have COLA ties. They're automatically adjusted based on this measure of inflation. And if that's incorrect, then it's not necessarily, we're gonna see how inflation can affect real GDP in real income in just a minute. But the goal of these COLA ties is to maintain a standard of living, to say, okay, we don't want the amount of goods and services that you can purchase each year to change. We want to make sure that you can at least purchase the same amount of goods and services as you did last year. However, when our CPI overstates the inflation rate, it's going to over adjust these incomes. And what we're going to find are that people have argued that the Social Security payments have actually gone up in value, in the value of the goods and services it can buy over time, along with other contracts. So the BLS does make adjustments, but most economists that have looked at the problem believe that the BLS still overstates inflation by about 0.5% each year. And so what we see when we're talking about the United States targeting a 3% inflation, 0.5% is actually quite a significant overstatement. So there are other versions of CPI. The BLS has come out with a chain CPI, and it attempts to better deal with this problem. So just modifying the process of calculating the CPI and inflation rate slightly in order to help deal with this problem. But chain CPI obviously also has critics, specifically AARP and people who are involved in Social Security payments who believe that it actually then understates the inflation rate. So some problems with CPI to be aware of and to recognize that they exist, that they're out there. And so as we're talking about inflation, the effect that this will have on our numbers that we're presented with in the media or wherever. All right, so moving on, we're going to talk about some of the redistribution issues and how do we calculate the effect that inflation has on our income, on the interest rates that we pay or receive.